Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Gallagher, president of the American-Scandinavian Foundation, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to Scandinavia House on this Arctic Day to hear more about the Arctic, specifically the artists who are in our current exhibition on the edge of the Arctic, or the Arctic Edge. They are with us today to talk about their work, their experiences working in the Arctic, with the distinguished photographer and critic, Erika Larsen. We're very pleased particularly to have them here today and also with this exhibition because it celebrates our fellowship program. ASF has been giving fellowships, cash awards to artists and scholars for over 110 years. And this enables Americans to go to Scandinavia, Scandinavians to come here to pursue their work and research. This year we have about $1 million to give away, so it's a great program. And this afternoon, the exhibition will be open after the lecture, and please visit it if you haven't already, and please go back if you would like to see it again. And I'd like to particularly thank the donors Inger and Bill Ginsberg, who made this exhibition possible. And of course, I want to thank all of our members for supporting us and all of our friends on our Scandinavia Online YouTube channel. So welcome, and now I'll turn it over to Emily Stoddard, who is going to introduce the artists.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you everybody for coming today. I'm just going to give a few words and introduction to our panelists today. As Ed mentioned too, that the exhibition's open this afternoon until 6, so I hope you stop by. And we've also extended its run till March 4th, so it's on for a few more weeks. Just a few things. The artists and Erika will be speaking for about an hour, and then we will have a Q&A afterwards, so feel free to save those questions for the end. Oh, and the other thing is that today's event will be recorded and later offered on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists, starting with Marion Belanger, who is interested in concepts of persistence and change and in the way that boundaries demarcate difference, particularly in regard to the land. She's been the recipient of a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, a John Anson Kitteridge Award, an American-Scandinavian Fellowship, Connecticut Commission on the Arts Fellowships, and has been an artist in residence at the MacDowell Colony, at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, at the Virginia Center for the Arts, and at Everglades National Park. Marion earned her MFA from the Yale University School of Art, where she was the recipient of both the John Ferguson Weir Award and the Schigel Collingwood Prize, and a BFA from the College of Art and Design at Alfred University. Her photographs are included in many permanent collections, including the Library of Congress, the National Gallery of Art, Yale University Gallery Art, the New Orleans Museum of Art, and the International Center of Photography. So thank you for being here. Clare Benson is a photographer and interdisciplinary artist whose work explores themes of family history, tradition, science, and mythology. She received her MFA from the University of Arizona and her BFA from Central Michigan University. In 2014 and 15, she was the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship Award to Arctic Sweden, and she has worked alongside space scientists and indigenous Sami reindeer herders, and we will hear more about that today. Her first book, The Shepherd's Daughter, was published in 2017 by Photo Lucida and in receipt of the Critical Mass Book Award. Benson's work has been featured in exhibitions, screenings, and publications across the US and internationally, and she is currently assistant professor of photography at the University of Connecticut. And I actually should also point out that both Marion and Clare have beautiful catalogs which are also available for sale downstairs in our shop, so I encourage you to take a look afterward. Steve Giovinco is a New York City-based fine art photographer who focuses on creating images of couples with himself and lyrical night landscapes. His work is collected in many museums, including the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and is exhibited widely in galleries, and received his MFA from Yale University School of Art. His series, Inertia, looks at the land, ice, and communities in southern Greenland, and we will be hearing more about that today. Finally, with Erika Larsen. Erika is a transdisciplinary storyteller who believes that photography is a practice to expand our understanding of time, place, and people. She is fascinated by how we communicate with nature and often focuses on learning from people who maintain strong relationships with the natural world. Her monograph, Sami Walking with Reindeer, reflects her time living in the Scandinavian Arctic. Her second monograph, Materia Prima, is a collection of photographs and poems that explore ritual and the process of remembering that we are nature. Her work has been included in the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery and the United States Embassy in Oslo. Erika is also a lecturer at the Peruvian University of Applied Sciences in Lima, Peru. So without further ado, I will let you start the conversation, and thanks again for being with us.
Thank you. Well, I first want to say thank you all for coming, because now you know what the Arctic feels like. And so it's very apropos for sitting here today. I just want to start off by saying the Arctic is one of the most special places on this planet, and it's truly magical. Today, this conversation with these three amazing artists will be able to just get a glimpse of what that magic is like through three different perspectives. But beyond magic, it's actually a really profoundly important place. The changes that are happening in the world, we're seeing them in the Arctic first. We see it through language, see it through landscape, through science, and that's also spoken about in all three of these artists' work today. So I was saying to Marion when we just sat here, to be a translator of the Arctic is a gift and it's a privilege. And thank you for coming to listen to this today. It's really, it's a very important place. So we're gonna start off. First, I'm gonna let each artist give you a bit of background on the work through their words. And Marion, if you would start.
Hi, thanks for being here. So I'm going to talk briefly about the work that's in the show upstairs. And it's from my series called Rift Fault. Rift represents the North American tectonic rift that goes mainly through the Atlantic Ocean, but also through the middle of Iceland. And fault represents the San Andreas Fault, the opposite edge of the North American tectonic plate. And most of us know that that goes up through the state of California, then out to sea. So I set out like an enormous task for myself. I wanted to photograph the two land-based edges of this plate. And I was drawn to it because I was discouraged and kind of like amazed at how much human beings had shaped the surface of the earth. I mean, people have become the major geologic force on Earth in the last 50 years. So I was wondering, where might there be a geologic boundary where it's kind of immune to that manipulation, where it's independent of statehood, financial interests, and I came up with tectonic plates. Tectonic plates are totally shifting all the time. They're moving. LA will be where San Francisco is in, many millions of years, but it's inching its way up there year by year. And Iceland is constantly growing. It's a different kind of meeting of the plates than what we have in California. So that plate is pulling apart, and the state itself is like getting new land every year. When you go to see the show, you're going to say, "Wow, this doesn't look like the Arctic." Yes, because it's California, but it's related to the Arctic in the sense that it's a geologic phenomenon, the other boundary of the plate that runs up to the Arctic. So this is very new land in Iceland. And it's incredible in Iceland because if you start like at the plate where the plates meet, you see lava and new land. It's hot. You could feel it. You could see the steam. There's all kinds of geologic activity. Then as you walk out from the plate to like the either way to the ocean, the land gets older and older and older. So that here's the lava in Iceland, and then hot lava you'll see earth forming. Then moss comes, it's the first. So it's really interesting in Iceland because you get to see living geology and, earth forming, land forming, and trees growing eventually when you get out far enough from the plate edges.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate it. So my name is Steve Giovinco, and these are some of the images that are upstairs. These are photographs that I made in Greenland, and they were sponsored by a grant from the American-Scandinavian Foundation, so thank you so much for that. It was really life-changing, and this was the second trip of traveling to Greenland. So basically what I do is, these are made at nighttime, so I have a digital camera and set on a tripod, and then I make these very long exposures. And so sometimes they're an hour long, sometimes they're 2 hours long. And as a result of that, they have this kind of very eerie, kind of unusual kind of light and shadow that's just very kind of unearthly or just from another world. And it kind of relates to the place itself, which is very primordial. And so I'm very interested in this, capturing this kind of unseen place. Both literally because it's hard to get to and maybe most people don't go to Greenland, but also this kind of other world that's kind of hidden behind and underneath and appears through these night photographs. And I think the idea that one reason that I'm very interested in the Arctic and Greenland is because on the one hand, it's a place for kind of literal change. There's like melting, there's glacial retreats, there's ice movement. And then it's also sort of a metaphor for change. So I kind of see it as like a symbol of where change is happening and it's trying to sort of capture that. And then that can almost be a place for other change that's happening, whether it's man-made or nature-based. And maybe just one brief thing that I'll mention too is that the work, it's usually completely dark at nighttime. Like there's very little moon and there's very little other light that's there. So I'm really looking into just like a void. And so only later do I see what it looks like after I've made the photograph.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and a big thank you to ASF and Scandinavia House and everyone who's organized the exhibition and all the programming around it. I first traveled to northern Scandinavia, the northernmost city in Arctic Sweden, which is Kiruna, on a Fulbright fellowship. And I actually will say that when I was researching for the project, I had found this place by way of Erika Larsen's photographs to know that there were indigenous peoples who were formerly semi-nomadic reindeer herders, but still reindeer herding. And what I was interested in was finding this place. I learned that there was a large community of space scientists and space research that was happening in the Arctic areas. And so I found that in Kiruna there is a Swedish Institute of Space Physics, and I was really interested in drawing these connections between what the space scientists were doing and how they were looking to space, and the history of the Sami mythology and the creation story that they came from the sun, and thinking about how these worlds sort of merge in that landscape. So when I first arrived there, one of the things that I became most aware of was the changing light. I arrived in September, and I've told some others that when I first got to Stockholm, people asked me, well, how long are you going to be here? And I said 10 months, and they said, oh no. And so I became very aware of that, the feeling and the energy around the fact that that we would lose the sun for a period of weeks. And so I became very interested in the ideas of light and dark and night and day, and this time when everything sort of slows down, and thinking about seeing and perception. So while I was at the Space Institute, I became very interested in a device that looked out the roof of the building that's called an all-sky camera, and it's capturing an image every minute of every night and only at night. And so I built these time-lapse videos out of the photographs, and I was very interested in the way that it speaks towards change and time, and thinking about looking at the sky and understanding our histories and looking towards our futures. And so in working with the Sami people as well, was very interested in that notion of the past and the future, and how we think about day and night. And I ended up also working with a scientist who studies the eyes of Arctic reindeer, and had come across a study and then reached out and went to London, UC London, where he was doing his research. And the interesting fact about the eyes of the reindeer is that there's a structure behind the retina that shifts from winter to summer, so that they can see in these very different light environments. So I was interested again in this idea of that sort of duality, and thinking about our relationship to the sun, the earth and the sun, and how this structure in the animal's eyes actually would adapt. And so thinking about, again, change and adaptation, and our relationship of the earth and the sun and the land that we're in.
So I want to start from there. So just quickly, because I think it's important for everyone to understand what they're seeing, and if you don't mind me, Claire, just saying, so this is the eye of the reindeer. That's what you're seeing right now, which is really, really incredible. What strikes me about it is I feel like I'm looking at the Northern Lights, and I think anyone sitting here would probably maybe have the same interpretation. But I want to talk about seeing, because we're all visual artists. Obviously, we take information in many other ways, but I've been thinking recently about sort of the ocular nature of how we interpret what's around us. If you think about all of the original storytellers, in many of these cultures in the Arctic back in the day, these were oral cultures. And so we were getting things that were coming in, through sound and through the ears. And then, as we sort of moved into different types of storytelling, into reading and all of these, we began to take things in really ocularly, and that really does change how we process the world around us. And what's interesting about these three artists, and I'm going to open this up to who's ever willing to take it, is, someone like Steve says, I'm not looking when I'm doing this. It's the time of the photograph. I'm experiencing with other senses. When I think about Marion's work, she's also saying, it's what we don't see. And then what Claire is doing is head on. She's just going right into the eyeball, but it's not really about seeing, right? It's about what we don't recognize in what we see. So is anyone willing to kind of talk a little bit about seeing the Arctic and the choice to be a photographer as an interpreter, using the photography to do this, because it's very specific?
When I made these photographs, I was using a 4x5 camera, which is kind of older technology, analog. You put it takes a big sheet of film, you put the dark cloth over your head, you look through a ground glass screen that's, the image is reversed and upside down. And so, when I'm composing the image, I'm actually not seeing the whole image. I'm like, I have to move my eyeballs around the screen to kind of look at the edges, then I look at the center. It's kind of a dim light, and it comes and goes, and sometimes you get light flares from, coming up from the sunshine that's getting underneath the blanket. So, at the moment of making the picture, it's like I do my looking kind of before I go under the dark cloth. I kind of compose it, and then there it becomes very abstracted, and it becomes, kind of a structural issue. I see the composition. So that's one layer of seeing. The other thing that you referred to is like what is unseen, and photographing the plates, and what's underneath the ground. It's like there's the boundary of the normal, kind of the plate itself, and you can see it or not. And then there's the boundary of what's underneath the earth that we're standing on, which we clearly cannot see. And so, the work alludes to that, but it doesn't actually show that. So some of the pictures look very mundane. There's a house, and sitting on a piece of land. Well, that house is on a fault that is actively moving and may erupt or, shake or whatever. But you're kind of taking my word for it.
I think I read it referred to as the dramatic changes in the unseen.
Yeah.
And I mean, in general, I think this is what's happening to us all the time, right? There's change going on all around us, and we can't take it. And I actually think even in your work, I think you said when you start to speak about the Anthropocene and how we are dealing with climate change, we actually can't take it all in.
Right.
We have to have levels of unseen to be able to process the world around us.
Yes. And, when I was photographing the plates, I worked with a scientist who was doing earthquake research, and he gave me sound, like recordings made like down into the fault itself. And so that, that's another way to access it, but like from a sonic landscape. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that, there's all of that, but then I have a granddaughter who's blind. So it's kind of opened up to me like different ways of experiencing the world, so it's like tactile or it's sonic. And I've become more and more interested in, the sonic landscape and how that may intersect with a visual kind of, photograph or video.
Well, if I could take that, this is very interesting. So there's a phenomenon, or I call it a phenomenon, and I would like to see if any of the three of you have experienced this, but in the coldest times of the Arctic, sound travels so much faster. You can hear like a tree branch break, and you will never see a tree. You're like on open tundra. And so there's this actually traveling of sound in the cold landscape. And so I wanted, since, everyone will get down to see the show, everything's about images, but would someone be willing to talk about the sound of the Arctic, especially in the coldest days, like today?
This is really fascinating because I think when you're initially talking, Erika, about the idea of kind of mythology and the other elements that are kind of maybe were forgotten about and then were replaced by image making maybe. And then I kind of began to think like, well, maybe there's also mythology about images too. And somehow that, as Marion was talking about, we can only see so much, and we're trying to capture, I think maybe all of us are really trying to capture things that can't be seen, ironically using a man-made mechanical object in this remote places. So I think that's something very interesting. But just to go back to that, and there's more to talk about that, but the sound I think is interesting because I was at the edge of kind of this dead glacier in Greenland, and there were two sounds, actually, now that you mention it, that were just really powerful. And one was like, I almost felt like there was a power plant, sort of like somewhere. And yeah, like a really strong, like Con Ed power plant or something. And that was the water rushing underneath the glacier. So it really sounded like this mechanical, throbbing, terrible sound. And it was really uncanny and very odd. But the other thing was I heard sheep, and this was an area where there were sheep farms. And so there were sheep that I couldn't see that were really far away, and they were on the other side of the glacier of this area. And so it was very odd to have this churning sound, the sheep that were unseen, that like, where the hell are sheep out there? So bizarre. And then like the Northern Lights, which is not sound, of course, but is like this kind kind of mythical light that's sort of coming over you and kind of enveloping you. So I think I think the idea of, how to visualize something, I think is really fascinating. How to visualize something that's a concept or an idea or a place or something that goes through time. And, there's a lot more to talk about that.
Well, I think, the thing that I've lived many years in the Arctic, and I've worked there for probably over 20 years now. And the thing that I find about the Arctic in general is in this idea of how do we put something into visual interpretation. I think the first step is you have to experience it, right? Our visual interpretation and the way that we take everything, it comes from that which we become a part of. And Claire, I want to talk a little bit about your work, because your work touches on things like a search for knowledge, magic, mortality, existence. And so I think, and you're working with scientists, and you're actually working very kind of highly technical technology to do some of this work, but at the end of the day, exactly what you're trying to explain is something that's maybe not visual whatsoever. Would you mind talk about that process a little bit?
I've, for a long time, been interested in these connections between things that, for me, are very strong connections or direct connections, but that most of us wouldn't normally think about connecting these different pieces. And I think that the idea of science, and I had a strong interest in the way that science was this sort of search for knowledge and understanding, and then at the same time was looking at family history and trying to connect with ancestors and traditions and elements like that. And so, I think that to me, it's very connected. I know when I spoke with Erika earlier this past week, we talked about the connections between science, when traditionally science was very connected to spirituality and alchemy and magic, and all of those things were very tied. So I feel like in my head, I'm still living in that world where these things are very connected. I don't know if that's...
Well, no, this to me, thank you. And it touches on the next question and everybody's work here. So I think, Claire and I talked a lot about this, and I'm in school for this Hermetic philosophy, and the thing that comes, most of the things we discuss is the time when science and, our spirituality and our connection to the landscape and the fact that our nature we're all intertwined, so you really couldn't separate it, right? And then we sort of hit the age of enlightenment and we become separate somehow, or at least we think we are, I think, or that's what's kind of comes out. And so, all of your work, I think the one thing that hit me the strongest of talking to all three of you was this human fragility, human disconnect from the landscape, the Anthropocene, and that what we're seeing in the change in the landscape is actually a cause of humans. And I think this is really, I just think it's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer, but, I asked you all, if we think nature's self-destructive, and are we a part of nature? And all of your work hits this head on, but in very different ways, in lyrical ways, and in the unseen, and in the discovery through trying to understand what it means to be human in these ways. So can we talk a little bit about that, about what it means to be a part of nature, but at the same time, really a part of changing the natural landscape?
Of course, we're part of nature, and I think that we've found ourselves in quite a pickle, because we're destroying our habitat, and so kind of really we have to do a major adjustment, and these things happen, in different degrees throughout nature, but it's really kind of out of whack and scary. And so I think I just think of things like, this green, shift to more green technology. I mean, that's respecting nature. It's harnessing the sun. It's not extracting oil. It's, all of this stuff. But photographically, I think that for me, most of my work has been about like this terrific power of nature. And on the other hand, how do people live upon the earth? And how do we, people live on the edge of a fault that is overlooking the ocean because, life is short. So it's cheap land because it's on a fault. I can enjoy the ocean. But, we know that time is long. So, it's kind of like, it's longer than we can conceive of. And so it's kind of readjusting the way that we think about, how things coexist in the long run. It's not a short term. People talk about, this discrepancy between older adults who don't really want to deal with climate change and the kids who are like really freaking out. Major anxiety about what's to come. And so there's like a big gap there that needs to, a major readjustment. So, and I think that all of the work I do kind of skirts around all of these questions.
And Steve, you talk a lot about inertia. I think it's really the one word that I took away from when we spoke. And I think your way to touch this sort of geological time versus the more corporal time, you do this through your photography by addressing a sense of inertia. Could you get a bit into that for us?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I was really thinking about this a lot last night, this idea of inertia and sort of how to capture these things that aren't seen either at nighttime or, as we were talking about, like climate change. How do you actually photograph it or capture it? And so I guess I was thinking it would be great to have a camera or make like a 5-year long photograph of the Arctic. Maybe it's been done, but I'm not going to do it. That's not possible. But I think in a way my work is kind of referencing that, because if I take like an hour-long photograph or 2-hour-long photograph, it's kind of hinting, again, not in a direct way, but it's kind of referring to this passage of time. And what is the passage of time? It's a way of sort of collecting, again, this kind of contrary notion, of you're taking a picture in, normally it's like a brief moment and you're capturing the moment, but how do you capture longer essence of that? And so by the longer exposure, I think I'm kind of referring to that idea of, how do you connect to these other things like inertia and like these natural events that are just kind of crushing forward. At least that's how I certainly see it, and certainly see it in Greenland. It's just like, I was able to feel like I was disappearing into the land and then also really connecting with it in some particular and very deep way. And I think that's also part of the inertia of just kind of being connected with it and just moving forward, if that makes sense.
No, thank you. And I'm, Claire, you're not going to get away from this question. I want to pose it to you as well, because there's a quote that was said about your work, and it says, "Can philosophical thought soften the gap between our consciousness of geological time and that of corporal time?" So talk to me about time in your work.
I'm interested in the way that we can look at time in a sort of collapsed way, or when I think about this project especially, I think about these sort of histories and futures that we're simultaneously investigating and trying to understand. And so thinking about not a collapse like when something collapses physically, but a sort of like zoomed out view where these things sort of collapse in a timeline and we can see them together. And then also thinking about like the infinite expanding universe. And so thinking about collapsing and expansion at the same time, where I remember talking to a PhD student. I was in the corridor of PhD students at the Space Institute. My door had a sign on it that said "artist." That was not I was not a space physicist or PhD student, but I remembered one reference that I had been told, which was that we have two ways of thinking about time in space physics or in this research, and the one is that everything is measured based on what we experience here on Earth, because that's the time we understand, and based on the days we experience and the revolution of our planet around the sun. And the other way is to just say that everything is infinite and immeasurable. And so, the one is it almost feels as though it's a little bit giving up. Like, we can't understand everything that's out there and the way that we sort of fit into this bigger picture, except through understanding from our perspective and from our understanding of time, and drawing everything kind of back to that. So I found that really interesting to imagine these two ways, and this one way is based on all that we have, which is how we perceive time, and the other one is just saying we actually know nothing, or we can't measure it all. And so I think this impossibility of understanding our place in these systems is really beautiful and interesting. I wanted to mention also, in reference to that question of change and the way that humans have impacted their environment and everything like this. I've recently got all the way through Donna Haraway's book called Staying with the Trouble, and I think that idea, what she argues, is that one of the best things, or the only things that we can really do in this circumstance, is to quote unquote stay with the trouble, or to have conversations and to ask questions and think about what it is that we're seeing all around us and how we're part of it, but to not give up on it, or to assume that like everything is lost. There are some dire pieces of information out there if we dig into it, but I think it's beautiful how she talks about, if we sort of pull things apart like it's a web where so many things are connected, and we ask questions and look at relationships across these different areas, that we can continue to discover something beautiful about the connections that are there.
Well, thank you, because that's going to lead me into my next question about audience. But I just want to mention one thing about the Arctic, just to also give the Arctic some props for what it can do. That there's this, I think, I haven't seen it, personally I haven't seen it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't seen it in other parts of, besides Antarctica or the Arctic, or you talk about the polar regions. But there's these sort of whiteouts that happen, and when you can be there and just everything becomes whited out, so you lose a horizon line. And if we really think about what happens to us when we lose horizon line, we lose a lot of our perspective to, I think, the sort of time and space that we use to locate us in the world. And so when that happens, I notice that like you really, time becomes expanded, and then you don't know where you're standing from. And so there's almost like a breakdown of the way that you relate to things. And so I found it as often the Arctic would, through these sort of physical climate changes, it would force me to perceive things in another way. And I think I remember sometimes sitting, especially when I think about the work you're doing, Marion, like this geological time. I mean, I remember sitting there. I'm like, I don't know if I've been here for 15 hours or 5 minutes. And it allows us to really think about the power of nature, but also the power that we have to connect to it. And so I want to talk about audience. So I was listening to this podcast actually yesterday on the way here to see Emily, and they said something about Paul Klee having some of his pictures on a wall, and he walked in, and everyone, oh, what do you think, or I don't know. And basically what he said, and I think it was an empty gallery, like he might have been going in for a walk, and basically he said, what's missing from this is the people. because the people are what bring the life to work. And I think about the ancient storytellers, I think about the shamans from the Arctic, and the stories don't exist without the audience, and vice versa. And that's where, things can kind of live and go off in a new way. So, we're as artists and looking at these changes, talk to me about the audience in terms of how important it is to share what you're sharing. Because I think, Steve, you said something that what a privilege it is to be able to see things like this, because not everybody gets to do it. But through your work, then you're able to share it here or share it in the gallery. Talk to me about the audience in terms of the work.
Yeah, so I think that's also a really good question, because I think that I am, a fine art photographer, so I'm trying to connect to people in art galleries, curators, museums, and other things, but also hope that someone else who is going down Park Avenue might look at the work and then begin to sort of wonder about how this might be affecting them in some way and kind of make a connection in some daily life. So there's melting that's happening in Greenland, and well, they're building the East River kind of wall in the East River Park. Or I'm reminded of if you remember Hurricane Sandy, that the subways were flooded. And that's kind of indirectly or very directly maybe related to climate change. So hoping that an average person can look at a beautiful photograph and maybe ponder and wonder, like, how am I being impacted by this? And, maybe I shouldn't drive as much, or, think about it, or be more sustainable or something like that. So as well as the other, kind of art audience.
I can speak to this a bit too, because I was based among scientists and Sami people, and then also thinking about the kind of art context that I was familiar with, or that I knew this work would someday be shared with. And I remember working with the scientists, they speak a very different language than artists, it feels like, even though it's actually very similar too. It's this language of inquiry and curiosity and looking for connection and pattern. But I remember also, I guess, while I was there and I gave a couple of presentations, I did a repeat presentation for all those scientists. And a couple of people showed up to both presentations, and I said, it's just going to be the same presentation. And they said, I really want to understand, I was very interested in the connections that you draw. So I think it's interesting to think about very different audiences that we do have, and how they might see something, of course, very different, but connect with it in different ways. I guess this is the beauty of art and sharing our perspective, is that everybody can bring something very unique and interesting to it.
Marion, I read something that you wrote, or maybe it was what we spoke about, I don't know which one, but the camera can create a conversation.
It certainly creates a conversation for me. I engage in a conversation about what I'm seeing in front of the camera. Some people say, how can you're out in nature, how do you determine where to put the frame? Because there are trees here, there are trees there. How do you choose to put the camera here? And, I don't know if I can precisely answer that, but, there's certainly some kind of conversation that occurs when I'm out in the field. But there's another conversation because I create a dialogue with my work. Like, I have an idea when I go out. I'm sure, artists have ideas, and then it's not until you actually make something to look at, and that something speaks to you about what the next step should be. So it's humbling in many ways, because it may not be what you planned. And so that process, that dialogue that goes back and forth between, your kind of subjective ideas, the research, the artist may do. I love to read books. I get so many of my subjects initiate, from books and things that I read. So it all kind of becomes a cacophony at some point where, there's like a lot of different influences, and then, it kind of gets crystallized, when you're editing down. And I wanted to just mention, like for me, in terms of audience, the book is really important. You know, I love the book because it's fairly inexpensive. It's democratic because it goes into libraries. It's accessible to people. And so the book to me is almost like more important than an exhibition. And I feel like more people will read the book, have access to the book. If you can't buy the book is free for you in libraries. And in the book, you know, all of that process of making gets crystallized into a narrative, some kind of narrative, where you turn the pages and there's an image that follows another image, and it creates meaning.
But in your book specifically with this, you actually, that the viewer, or I guess the holder of the book, the audience, has the ability, they really have some agency. We have the ability to put images next to each other in different ways. Can you talk about that decision?
Yeah, so in my book, Riff Fault, I have kind of two books in one, and you can turn the pages flip up instead of out, and you can flip Rift and flip Fault. So, like, it's certainly paired in a particular way that I structured, but you can turn the pages and pair one image of Fault with an image from Rift, any way you want. And I thought of that from the very beginning. That was important to me because the plates are constantly shifting. And I wanted the structure of the book to reflect that geologic fact. But it also is like, it does kind of give the viewer some agency as to determination. How do you want this book to be read? So you have my interpretation, and it's not the only interpretation. I could vary that, but you can also make your own interpretation.
All of this work, right, it exists because of these artists, but it also exists because there's an audience to discuss it. And the topics they're talking about is, our connection to the natural world and what that looks like. But in this specific body of work upstairs, I think there's one person in the images, and that's yours, Claire, and that the person's looking away. So in Marion's work, there's really an absence of any people, but of course, everything you're talking about affects people. Steve as well, not a person. And then Claire, you have one person sort of walking away. So in all of this work, there's no people. Can we talk a little bit about that? Yeah, Marion, go please.
I'll say a little to start. I think, so to me, there is one other person vaguely in my work, which is these hands that are holding the eyes. But I do think there has been a conscious choice to not really include people or faces. And I don't know that I could outline exactly what that instinct is, but I do think that I feel like there are people very much part of it. And I guess when I think about the others' work too, I think people are very much a part of this. When I see the red glow of Steve's work, that you imagine the kind of connection of humans to this landscape and the way that our structures are sort of occupying space in these worlds. So I guess I think that there is also a kind of quietness when there are less people or no people, and maybe a space for us to enter into it and imagine a connection or feel like we're in this quiet, almost silent space of experiencing this.
Yeah, well, in Greenland, there's not a lot of people, is one kind of thing. By the way, there's like 56,000 people that live in Greenland, and that's about the size of Stuyvesant town, which is like a few blocks away. But I think the idea of, I kind of envision it as like this primordial place that I'm kind of visiting or witnessing. And it's also almost like a kind of like a post-human existence, although there's some references like Claire mentioned, there might be like a glowing red light in the distance that indicates, well, that's kind of humanity somehow or somewhere, and it's kind of interacting with this raw space, and we're just like kind of a teeny we're just sort of witnessing the land in Greenland and perhaps everywhere. So I think that's, and I used to photograph people all the time and myself, but I really shifted away to photographing the land, and it just seems like I'm kind of imbued in the land as well.
So there are no people in the photographs up in the gallery. In my book, there are 2 photographs that have people. And I thought this as the project as a portrait of the fault and rift. I mean, that was my subject. And the evidence of all of us living upon the place are there. I mean, it's there everywhere in the photographs. But I just want to say I do photograph people, but it's just
No, it's just not in the.
it's just not up there in the gallery.
Well, no, and especially with your work, Marion, there's a quote, I don't know if you said it, I don't remember now, but it's, referring to your work as living, or this work specifically for this exhibition and for Rift Fault for the book, but living on the edge of Earth, we're at the mercy of the geological process. It becomes humbling, and we get out of the realm of small concerns. And I think, and I bring up the people, not because I think, and yeah, because Steve's work, I mean, all of your work about inertia before was relationship-based, but I think it's interesting because when I look at this work, I can't help but to think about people and who we are in this process. And in the Arctic, but the Arctic has a way to isolate you, to make you feel like you might be the only person in this entire expansive universe. And at the same time, it will break you, like completely break you down to kind of reemerge into the world again. And when I experience these 3 artists' work, it is a version of what the Arctic can do when you're there in person. And that's the power of art, and it's also the power of artists, being willing to go out there and be vulnerable and to try to learn something so that they can translate it out. So thank you. And now more importantly, your questions.
There was a lot about the scale of time, and in Marion's work, it's decades, and in your work, there's a year, and in Steve's work, it's hours. But there's sort of unseen, we know it happens, but it's hard to kind of perceive it. But how we perceive it is normally through feeling the calendar year, and also through our own mortality. We age. But we've messed with both of those at this point, to the point where there's the climate crisis, and we don't have seasons in quite the same way. And you're talking about the Arctic, the light being different. So if you move into a space where night is day and day is night, or there isn't a day. And then the other thing is we've also played a lot with our longevity. So we're living quite differently. So our perception of time is even altering even more. So I'm wondering how that kind of tampering fits in to this kind of trying to map out time. And the other thing is, I really loved what you said. I think it was Donna Haraway who had the making the web out of the staying with difficult things. I think that's a good definition, very loose definition for what art can do, which is to have conversations about difficult things in a way that's manageable to us. It filters, we've got enough constraints that it's possible to have those conversations. So anyway, I was interested in how time has actually been altered and our perception of it.
I'll say something to start. I think one of the things I'm thinking of is that when I was up there in Kiruna, there was also something happening that was really special and unique during that time, was that there's a underground mine that's an iron ore mine in Kiruna, and there were a lot of news people coming and reporting on it because the town was beginning to shift the town, the center of the town, to another location because the vein of iron ore was going underneath the city that they were going to continue digging. And so this element of our impact and the sense of time, the town was like around 100 years old, but there was a sense of history and tradition or generations of people who had been in a certain place or building or connected to a certain space that was their home and had to move because of this human impact that was going into the landscape, right, where they had built the town. So, and I think that became a really interesting thing for me because I was also interested in the way we look up, but also, we're sort of like pointing instruments up to find new information and knowledge, and then at the same time going down and extracting and exploiting the resources for all of these things that we use in the world that we live in. So, I mean, I think that element felt really present and was sort of inescapable in the end. I don't know that, I think it just draws for me it drew in another piece of the puzzle, and something that became a bigger part of that web was to kind of try to think about the relationship of all these things and the way that a town of 100 years old could easily sort of, one of the buildings was physically going to be put on wheels and moved across the town, and so it's just kind of wild that we can do these things. So,
I'm wondering, any of you, how our physical bodies or human bodies reflect geology or the terrain, because I think we do. How our physical bodies might reflect or mimic or carry some of the changes in geology and the earth?
It's an interesting question.
I think.
Yeah. I think that it's just our lifespan is just so small. We weather, we age, we shrink. Shifts occur. A friend of mine just got her shoulder replaced. I saw the X-ray. It was like kind of amazing, so this idea of being cyborgs, reminds me of like things that we put into the earth to hold, it's mainly extraction, but other stuff as well. I don't know if anybody else wanted to.
Well, yeah, I think that's interesting. I guess what came to mind for me was, maybe not me, but when I was in Greenland, there were farmers and sheep farmers, and just seeing how I went initially there like 5 years ago and then came back 5 years later. And so I could literally see changes that have occurred, like ice has literally retreated and other things have happened. And so it's impacted them, the farmers, because they're physically, working with the land, and they used to physically be able to go across from one town to the other during the winter, but now they can't because it's too warm. So I guess I'm just thinking about that physicality in terms of how they're living their lives and how it's being altered to them, and how the physicality for them is being altered.
I think I'll add something to that Marion's reference to, that we are our timeline is so small compared to what we know has and will exist. But I think also about in terms of perception and seeing and optics that sort of started some of the conversation, is that if we look at the visible spectrum of light that's visible to us as humans, it's so small compared to what we know is even measurable by devices that we have. So it's fascinating to imagine all the things that we actually can't see and that we can't know and that we can try to measure, but that we'll never fully understand or feel. So it's quite beautiful to think of how small we are, actually, and yeah.
I thought that all of the works were very, very compelling. In particular, Steve, I wanted to ask you, so the work, the different pieces that I saw bring about different emotional reactions in me when I'm looking at them. And Steve, when I look at your work in particular, it's compelling and it's beautiful, but I also feel a lot of fear because it's like looking at a different planet, a place that I've never seen the likes of that on Earth. And I've just wondered what the personal experience was like. Were you scared? Were you alone? Were you cold? Emotionally, what did being in this place under those circumstances do to your head? And what was that experience like?
Yeah, and also shout out to Regina. This is like 2 or 3 lifetimes ago, I might say. So thank you so much for coming. It really means so much to me. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I was terrified for most of the time. The first time I went, I thought I might get lost and die or something.
I was thinking about death when I was looking. I was like, oh God, I'm going to die out here. So I wondered if you felt that.
The first time I was really, really scared. The second time, because I actually had to go back to the same area, I was really familiar with it. But I think, I was alone, and it can be very challenging to do that. But on the other hand, I sort of alluded to this a little bit before too, that it's, I don't meditate, but it kind of reminds me of like a walking meditation, what I imagine that would be like, because I'm working at nighttime with a headlamp and also with my phone that has a map on it that can be, so that was a lifesaver. It was terrifying, but also very beautiful, and again, sort of like dissolving into the land and so it's very enlivened, very kind of, feeling alive and also disappearing at the same time. And then just as a side note, just to be sane, I would listen to BBC podcasts and other weird things that I would listen to. And music was almost too scary for me to listen to because I was already in this other kind of altered state. So I don't want to go farther away. I wanted to hear, I would hear human voices talking with the podcast. And I found that to be helpful because there would be, maybe a week or 2 where I wouldn't speak to anyone else. And then I might speak to someone for hi, how are you? When's the boat? And okay, and then see you later. That was part of my experience.
You all sort of alluded to activism in relationship to art, and you clearly want your audience to have both an artistic reaction and to take some sort of action would be, I assume, what you would most like. Can you talk about sort of the relationship between activism and art and how you think about it?
I don't expect people to become activated, to go out and do things so much from looking at my work. I mean, maybe somebody might, but it's not one of my intents. So personally, I think of my work as more like poetry, and it kind of exists alongside other things. It adds to the conversation, but I don't see it as that's not my purpose.
I'll speak to that. I think that all of us do recognize some of the big problems or big questions that we're being forced to ask as humans. And I think that as an artist, I feel like I find myself in the role of a translator or somebody who's kind of seeing something and trying to bring up questions or draw connections across different ideas and allow people to connect with this place or this phenomena or the bigger picture and bigger questions in a different way, in a new way. And it's not the right way or anything, but it's kind of seeing things in a new light and from a new perspective, and to think about maybe different people bringing different connections or insight, or to feel a different sense of responsibility, or the ways that different people can connect with it, to think about what's happening and what can be done.
Just briefly, yeah, I'm not an activist, but I guess I'd see, creating this work and hopefully people will see it and, like, as I mentioned earlier, maybe ponder about it and wonder, what is this like? How is this impacting me? And maybe they can make some minor changes to their way of living or thinking.
I want to just add something that just from talking to all three of you, especially in relation to that question, is that they use different terms, but I think what I heard from all of you is, some of it was sort of witness / participatory, but that you had to go out and see it. And maybe your work isn't about activism, but you are bringing it out. You're translating it. I even think, Marion, specifically with your work, like you are bringing the unseen out in a really kind of uncomfortable way. And it's like, whoa, you have to, so maybe it isn't like they're not walking out as activists, but would you all consider that you're very much witnessing something, participating in it, and translating it out to have us think and maybe even change a behavior or change a thought. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's a great word, which I had never really thought of or connected to, like translator. And I'm going someplace else, bringing it back, and then it's kind of filtered through us as artists.
Great, thank you so much for this. So I have a question. I was thinking as I was sort of looking at your work, how this fits into the kind of long history of people sort of coming in and thinking about the Arctic. There's a really long history of this, and I think on the surface there might be a lot of similarities. We have 19th century explorers coming in, rendering this place uninhabited, empty, a frozen wasteland there to be like an inert set of resources for colonists to mine. Lots of pictures of reindeer, dead and alive. But I'm curious to see how you see your work in relation to this, but also, to me, the biggest difference is that those 19th century colonists all took their photos with incredible hubris, like it was a sign of conquering. It was incredibly arrogant, like we are here, we have tamed this land, and implicitly it's people's. In your collective works, I saw a lot of humility, but also the uncanny. And so I'm sort of curious in my second question, like, what do you see the role of the uncanny in contemporary climate crisis discourse? Because this is also very different from the views of the Arctic. We see, the sort of starving polar bear on ice, crashing, glaciers like crashing to the ground. There's a sense of crisis, of loss, of tragedy, of blame, like you, viewer, are to blame for this sad polar bear. And a lot of people have talked about how that's just not very effective. And what I see you doing is something like very strikingly different. I think it might have something to do with the uncanny, but maybe you're trying to do something different. And so I'm curious sort of where you see your work fitting into like the long history of Arctic imaginaries, and also, in the way we sort of today think about the images of the planetary emergency. So thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I think that's a really great question. I really love the idea of like linking kind of conquering or colonial ideas with photography. And I think there's a long history of that. And I think there's also a history in photography of documenting change, whether it's man-made or not, or other ideas behind that. But I think that's something that photography, quote, does well, or there's a history of that, of photographing land and, the Western landscape and things like that. But in terms of the uncanny is something that I'm really interested in. And again, I think we all sort of talked about this of like, how do you photograph an idea of like something that's so abstract as climate change? Yes, you can see like a falling glacier or something, but I think, we're artists and we're, like poetry, I think Marion mentioned correctly, is a way to access in a more authentic way, or like that's the only way I know how to do it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But I think that's, maybe that's a way that will connect or resonate in some more authentic way, I guess is the idea.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of gears spinning right now that I'll try to stay on track and answer it concisely, but I think that concept of conquering or of like mapping territories or understanding this landscape, I actually think that when Erika spoke about this magic that's in the Arctic, for me, part of that was this kind of humbling moment or feeling that the landscape will do what it's going to do also. I mean, there is a sense and a lot of new things that are happening with ice melt and priorities of some people that are thinking, well, now we can do oil drilling, and like that the melting of ice is opening up all this opportunity. But I think we're seeing the consequences in a lot of ways, and how actually the landscape is going to speak back, and it's already doing it. So I guess I think the uncanny and the magic is this. There is for me a feeling of powerlessness also, or of letting the things go as they're going. I don't know. It's an interesting contrast then to this idea of conquering, and it makes me wonder if some of the people throughout history got up there and thought, oh gosh, I feel so insecure and I feel powerless, and so I'm going to put off this sense that actually I'm very powerful and I've conquered this landscape. And it's a difficult and complicated question. Yeah.
I was just going to say it was like that. It was a different age, the age of exploration, and I think that's, it's kind of over with. But I think those other images that you were talking about, the polar bear and stuff, it's kind of early activism, and they're tired now. People have seen them. There's so many of them. People don't respond. So, I think we wouldn't be making those images anyways, but, just in terms of, it's a different, we're saturated with those, so.
And I think the question, I really like it because also, I think it's, right, we keep talking about translating and who's the translator. I mean, what translation of a book do you read from, Russian to English, or, whatever you have. And so, I think they've maybe all referred to themselves as poet, and if not, I will do it. There's poetry in what they're doing, and I think it allows the space for us to interpret what's going on, but also by getting sort of unfiltered sort of information. But someone said about Clare's work, and I think it actually fits for all three of your work, in sort of beauty or the uncanny in the unknown. And so within that, when the artist or when the poet embraces in there, there's this web of nuance where we can ask questions quietly. And I think I would say when I see your work, you've all done that. You've immersed yourself. You're asking questions quietly, but the work speaks so loud, but it also doesn't hit us over the head like a polar bear picture. It allows us to really think about, I love what you said, think about you look at Steve's images, you think about your mortality, you think about death. That's really powerful that an image can do that to you. And that says something about where, these artists have put themselves to be able to translate that out. And, but anyways, yeah, it was really beautiful. They said this sort of web of nuance where we can ask questions quietly. And when the artist is doing that, and translate it allows us to do that as well.
Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing your work and for doing this panel. But my question is a little bit more on your process. What is it like to sort of go into and live in Arctic communities, and how do you go about building relationships and connections with people who you're kind of living with?
I interacted with two main communities, which were the scientists and the Sami people, and I was very. I went in wanting to be very sensitive to this idea of, or the history of, being an outsider and going in and kind of being interested in this culture and you know, the traditions in this kind of othering sense. And I remember I actually, when I first got up there and I was just doing research before even going for the project, I remember thinking I really need to connect with some of the Sami people and like in a way that would allow me to see into this, but not be like the scientist that's researching people. And so I think that I actually I was just telling the group over lunch that I met this woman when I was out behind the Space Institute. I was walking up the mountain and picking blueberries, and I met this woman that was, you know, we connected on this hike, and she was asking questions, and it turned out to be this woman who's a pretty famous artist, or she's well connected in northern Sweden, and is from Greenland, and does traditional dancing, traditional Greenlandic dance. And she's married to a Sami reindeer herder. And so she said, you have to meet my husband. And I feel like making some of the connections that I did, people were like, oh, you're going to have to meet this person. You're going to have to meet that person. One of the scientists said, oh, we have a scientist who's married to a Sami guy also. And so there's, you know, I feel like there is this thing in Scandinavia that is a little bit of a, people would tell me, oh, they're kind of cold at first. You know, it's hard to get to know people or get them to open up. But when they do, it's really, you form really lasting bonds and people open up really quite a bit. So I think what was important for me was to approach it with a sense of sensitivity and understanding that I'm not gonna tell anybody, you know, what it's like here or what the people are, who the people are, but that being in that environment and kind of trying to be receptive to what people were experiencing, what the history had been, and how it even continued. So, yeah.
There was a deep language barrier. I barely knew like a few words of Greenlandic, which is like incredibly hard. And then the second language in Greenland is kind of Danish, and then there's a little bit of English. So I would try to interview and talk to farmers and try to, so I'd meet them and like ask how they, you know, sort of kind of do interviews while I was there and try to understand like how have things changed and try to connect to them like that. And then also there were a number of scientists that were around, and I would also try to talk to them and just kind of listen to what projects are they doing, what are, you know, there was like, you know, a whole range of like 20 different scientists that were there doing like 10 different projects. So just always kind of try to talk to them and connect in that way.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming. We really do appreciate it, and thanks again to all of you. It was a wonderful discussion today.